I found the right words, you must remember that I've always earned my living by my pen and by my tongue.
Churchill book collector, specializing in works by and about Sir Winston S. Churchill and collectible works by all authors.
Hi, I'm Marc with Churchill Book Collector. Despite our name, today rather than Churchill, I want to talk to you about perhaps America's most exciting president, Theodore Roosevelt, and arguably his most exciting book. This is the first edition of Theodore Roosevelt's The Rough Riders, the 1899 first edition published by Charles and Scribner's Sons of New York. This first edition is special for a number of reasons. First of all, it was the book that encapsulated what Theodore Roosevelt later on called his crowded hour. He recruited and led perhaps America's most storied cavalry regiment in the Spanish-American War, and famously in the Charge of San Juan Hill. And this is his story of that story. This binding is a beautiful example of the best craftsmanship and fine binding. It is full brown leather, bound by Zaehnsdorf for Asprey of London. But as beautiful as the binding is eclipsed by its contents. This particular copy is signed by Roosevelt on the leaf that precedes the half title. And in addition to being signed by Roosevelt, also in 5 lines you'll see an inscription. And this inscription is by one of Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders, one of the men who charged with him up San Juan Hill, inscribed to the Rough Rider's mother. The man who would become America's 26th and youngest ever president was a fascinating contradiction in a lot of ways. He was the son of an aristocratic New York family, and he was privileged and grew up and educated by the best of institutions and not in want or privation of any kind. And yet he would become a naturalist and a conservationist and a rancher, in addition to being a politician and an incredibly literate and accomplished author. Throughout his whole life, Teddy Roosevelt defined himself not just by his intellect, but by his physical courage and his physical presence. And he sought to prove himself in this way. And this book encapsulates the opportunity long sought and finally achieved to do just that. When the Spanish-American War was declared by Congress in 1898, Roosevelt was serving as Undersecretary of the Navy. And much to the chagrin of his president and his friends and associates, he immediately submitted his resignation and bartered for and wheedled for the permission to form a regiment of cavalry to fight in the Spanish-American War. And that regiment of cavalry was supposed to be composed of marksmen and frontiersmen and accomplished riders. So successful was Roosevelt in promoting the regiment that they received more than 20 applications for only 800 slots in a matter of days. But Roosevelt, sensing something perhaps of himself, or perhaps in something of the emerging America that he wanted to represent, petitioned to expand the regiment to also include a troop of Easterners, men who had backgrounds like himself, and to put that together with the frontiersmen and marksmen and horsemen and rough riders that he had recruited for the regiment thus far. Henry Worthington Bull was one of those Easterners that Teddy Roosevelt specifically recruited. He was raised in high society in New York. He graduated from Columbia University. The newspapers would call members of Roosevelt's regiment, like Worthington Bull, the millionaire recruits, the Fifth Avenue boys, but they ultimately proved themselves in the regiment in Cuba, just as Roosevelt did himself. The charge of San Juan Hill led Teddy Roosevelt to the White House. It led Bull back to Wall Street, where he resumed his career as a stockbroker. In 1904, Bull married the fiancée of one of his fellow Rough Riders who had been killed in service. And in 1910, Bull was selected to hand-deliver an invitation to Roosevelt for a reunion of the Rough Riders. It was no mean feat. He had to deliver it in London, which he did, and Roosevelt returned to New York for the reunion. Fitting for a former cavalry officer, Bull had a lifelong love of horses, which continued when he returned to his life as a stockbroker in New York, and continued throughout his life. In fact, Bull's daughter eventually married Fred Astaire, who shared with Bull this love of horses. You'll have to forgive us. It's impossible for us to talk about Teddy Roosevelt without also talking about Winston Churchill. These are two men that seem to have so much in common in their mannerisms and their dispositions, and yet failed to develop the kind of friendship and bond that you might have expected. They first met in December 1900. Churchill was 26, and he had just been elected to Parliament and hadn't yet taken his seat. Teddy Roosevelt was 42, and was the sitting governor of New York and elected vice president of the U.S. One would have expected them to hit it off. They were both brash men. They were both had a regard for physicality and physical bravery. Churchill had charged at Omdurman in the last great cavalry charge of the British Empire, just 2 months after Theodore Roosevelt had charged up San Juan Hill. Both of them had a fascination with naval power. Churchill would become First Lord of the Admiralty during the First World War. Theodore Roosevelt, of course, had been Undersecretary of the Navy. Both men were more than willing to contravene their parties and the prevailing sentiment of their class in order to champion progressive social reform. Both men had no problem expressing themselves. Both men were highly literate, educated, and authors. And yet somehow they didn't hit it off. History had a lot in store for both men when they met in 1900. Both men would go on to head their respective governments twice. Roosevelt, of course, as president, and Churchill as prime minister. And both men would have trouble relinquishing power, not surprisingly. Roosevelt was contemplating another run for president when he died, and Churchill, of course, didn't relinquish his second and final premiership until he was 80 years old. Nonetheless, the two men never developed a relationship, which really has to be laid at the feet of Roosevelt. It was Roosevelt's daughter who later quipped the reason why her father didn't like Churchill was because they were so much alike. Thank you for watching. See you next time.
Visit us at www.churchillbookcollector.com or direct any inquiries to info@churchillbookcollector.com.